Opened by the Chair of the Work and Pensions Select Committee, Sir Stephen Timms.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm very grateful to have been granted today's debate about DWP spending. I want to focus in my remarks in particular on universal credit, whose rollout started 10 years ago this year in 2013. But DWP is forecast to have, by some considerable margin, the highest expenditure of any government department, £279.3 billion this financial year, followed by the Department of Health and Social Care at £201 billion. So it's by a considerable distance the largest. Of course, the DWP forecast is uncertain. Almost all its funding counts as annually managed expenditure. Hard to forecast demand-led spending. DWP's admin spending, the resource DEL, is 27% lower in real terms this year than it was in 2010-11. The universal credit spending is forecast to be £50.8 billion this financial year, which is £8.8 billion higher than forecast in these estimates last year, reflecting both the recent, much-needed uprating and also a higher caseload. In February, 4.5 million households were receiving universal credit payments. One of the key arguments in the business case for universal credit was the prospect of reducing fraud and error. Nearly a quarter of the £34 billion net present value gain expected over 10 years from introducing universal credit was due to come from lower fraud and error. In fact, fraud and error have been much worse than they were with the legacy benefits. The Department's May statistics this year show that the universal credit overpayment rate did decrease, but it decreased from an astronomical 14.7% last year to the year before last to 12.8% last year. Now, I know that the Department is setting out to address this problem and has obtained some resources from the Treasury to do so. Underpayments were actually the highest ever recorded last year at 1.6%. But I do hope the Minister will be able to tell us about plans for tackling those problems. An additional reason it's so important to get the decisions right at the moment is that universal credit is a passport to cost of living support payments. There was, Madam Deputy Speaker, a strong case for merging the various benefits into universal credit, and the success of the system in getting urgently needed support out effectively in the pandemic was very important and also very impressive. But there are some big problems. Above all, the problem of the 5-week wait between applying for benefit and receiving the first payment. With legacy benefits, the first payment would arrive usually a week and a half or so after applying. With universal credit, having spent hundreds of millions of pounds on what we were always assured was agile technology, the same thing now takes 5 weeks. That is a very fundamental and unnecessary flaw. The security is absent from social security. The government rejected in January 2021 the Select Committee's recommendations to eliminate the wait and instead to pay all first-time claimants of universal credit a starter payment equivalent to 3 weeks of the standard allowance of universal credit, just to tide people over. The government response pointed out, of course, that claimants can access advances, but those are loans. Repayments reduce the already low monthly awards. Repaying advances is a very major driver of the explosive growth that we've seen in food bank demand. Our colleagues in the other place on the Lord's Economic Affairs Committee, with their Conservative chair, they succinctly highlighted the consequences of the 5-week wait in July last year. And I quote, "The 5-week wait for the first payment drives many people into rent arrears, reliance on food banks and debt." So I do want to ask the Minister once again if the government will reconsider our recommendations or whether we have to wait for a different government for that fundamental flaw to be addressed. One area where the government has listened to the committee I'm very pleased to say, is on reimbursement of childcare costs for people claiming universal credit. I warmly welcome lifting the cap and the upfront payments for childcare announced in the budget, and I hope our future reports will have comparable levels of success. And those changes will support people to be in work in future. The Child Poverty Action Group published a fascinating report last week called You Reap What You Code, highlighting areas where the Universal Credit Computer System does not deliver what it should. They gave the example that legislation and guidance allow some groups to submit a universal credit claim up to a month in advance, but the system doesn't allow that. And there isn't an adequate workaround either outside the digital system. So some care leavers and prisoners expecting release can miss out on entitlement which they are due. For all its success in the pandemic, and I am kind of unstinted in my recognition of that, for all that success, the rigidity of the digital system is a problem. And I wonder if the Minister is able to tell us whether a fix is planned for that problem of early claims highlighted by Child Poverty Action Group last week. Do the level of benefits meet need in the way they are supposed to? Are they representing value for the taxpayer? The committee is conducting an important inquiry at the moment into benefit levels in the UK. That'll report in the first half of next year. Benefit levels are very low. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation, the Trussell Trust, told the committee, and I quote, the basic rate of universal credit, its standard allowance, or equivalents in previous systems, is now at its lowest level in real terms in almost 40 years. That's CPI adjusted, and its lowest ever level as a proportion of average earnings. They estimate from pretty careful research that a single adult needs £120 a week to cover essentials: food, utilities, vital household items, travel. That's excluding rent and council tax. Universal Credit's standard allowance is £85 per week for a single adult over 25. That's a shortfall of at least £35 per week. And deductions, for example, for advance payments often pull actual support well below the headline rate. So they call for an essentials guarantee. And they make the point, and indeed it's been suggested this week, that in the press, that we might get a below inflation uprating of benefits next year, making these problems even worse. And I would be grateful if the Minister can give us any reassurance on that front, because that would be very bad news indeed. Yes, I will give way.
Very grateful to Chairman and Select Committee for giving way. Does he agree with me that the government needs to resist this temptation to try and plug the gaps with these one-off payments, but actually look at the wider, more structural problems that we have with the social security system, rather than just trying to plug gaps when the thing's falling apart at the seams?
Yeah, I think the old gentleman makes an important point, and I very much value his contribution to the work of the Select Committee, and I hope we will be able to look at some of those structural issues in the course of our inquiry. I think he's quite right. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, if universal credit did meet basic needs, other demands, including on food banks, would decrease. When the £20 a week uplift was introduced to universal credit, there was a significant drop in food bank usage. When the uplift was removed, food bank use went straight back up again. Universal credit was intended to make work pay, but how can it achieve that if people don't have, for example, the means to pay a bus fare? Trussell Trust, Joseph Rowntree Foundation, Public Law Project, all highlighted in evidence to the committee not being able to buy public transport tickets as a significant barrier to work. As far as we can tell, Madam Deputy Speaker, the government has made no assessment at all of whether benefit levels are adequate. If I'm wrong about that, I'd very much welcome the Minister telling us, but there's certainly no evidence of such an assessment ever having been made, and I hope that the Department will look very carefully at the findings of our report when they are in due course published. One other point highlighted in a briefing for this debate prepared by the charity Barnardo's. They described the two-child limit as the single biggest policy driver of child poverty in the UK. Ending it, they say, would be the most cost-effective way of reducing child poverty, lifting 250,000 children out of poverty and easing the poverty of a further 850,000 children. The cost of doing so would be £1.3 billion per year. And I must say, Madam Deputy Speaker, I am puzzled about the justification for the two-child limit. It presumably reflects a belief that parents should not have more than 2 children. But I don't think that is the government's view, as far as I can understand it. Indeed, members opposite are starting to worry, understandably, about our falling birth rate. So why do we refuse to provide support for children beyond the first 2? Isn't it now time just to scrap that limit, which doesn't really seem to make any sense? Another reason for higher DWP expenditure this year is the continuation of cost of living support. Expenditure is forecast to increase by just over £2 billion this year through higher payments, £900 in this financial year compared to £650 last, and also higher take-up. The payments have been crucial, but they do not fully meet need. In particular, the £150 disability support payment. Maddie Rose of MENCAP told the Select Committee last month that it is clearly not commensurate with the extra cost that those eligible incur, and we've heard some strong evidence along those lines to the committee. Helen Barnard of the Trussell Trust told the committee last month it has certainly helped the families that have got it, these cost of living payments, but of course it is a flat payment. It is not calibrated for the number of people you are trying to feed. So it has clearly gone less far if you're a family with children than if you're a single person or a couple. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, that is one of the reasons why the Trussell Trust data shows a faster rise in food bank demand amongst families with children than among families without. The lump sum nature of the payment is problematic. Citizens Advice, speaking for many, told the committee that increments to universal credit would be better than one-off payments. Our colleagues in the Treasury Select Committee called on the government last December for monthly payments over a 6-month period to give more household support at the time of their greatest need and to reduce the severity of the disincentives to work. The government rejected that proposal, essentially due to the limitations of the IT system, but as we know from the pandemic, monthly universal credit can be increased overnight. The need to meet a specific qualifying period for each payment window has led to what evidence to the committee has described as a cliff edge, where receiving a nil universal credit award one month, perhaps due to a sanction or a higher salary due to back pay or a bonus, those cause recipients to become ineligible for the entire cost of living support payment in that qualification period. I am looking forward to discussing cost of living support further with the Minister's colleague, the Minister for Social Mobility, Youth and Progression at the committee tomorrow morning. A very important aid, Madam Deputy Speaker, in achieving effective spending is transparency over how the money is being spent and what is being achieved. The department has had a very poor record in recent years, so I do warmly welcome signs of a new commitment to transparency since the appointment of the new Secretary of State. Keeping things hidden, which has been the department's practice, has the short-term advantage for ministers of avoiding them having to answer sometimes awkward questions. But over the medium and long term, people depending on the department form the impression that it is conspiring against them. The result is terrible mistrust, causing the department over time very serious problems. And for example, the very serious lack of confidence in the DWP amongst disabled people at the moment. It doesn't have to be like that, but changing things requires deliberate effort on the department's behalf. None of the recently introduced employment support initiatives had regular performance reporting on introduction. I warmly welcome the Minister's announcement of 6 monthly performance reports for Restart. That is one of the signs of welcome change in the department's approach. But that should be the norm, part of the arrangements built in at the outset, not something that has to be dragged kicking and screaming from the department subsequently. Greater openness could deliver a wholly different relationship between the department and the people depending on its services, where the department is seen to be working with those it's serving rather than conspiring against them. An interesting suggestion in the Child Poverty Action Group report, which I referred to earlier, You Reap What You Code, is that the source code for the Universal Credit Computer System should be published. Now, there would no doubt be some security concerns about doing that, but couldn't perhaps a small team with experts from disability groups, citizens' advice, with software experts be charged with reviewing that software, having a look at it and proposing improvements, maybe in an annual report, perhaps a little bit along the lines of what the Social Security Advisory Committee does elsewhere at the moment. Madam Deputy Speaker, let me just say briefly a word about a different aspect of the committee's work. We've been worried by the cuts to the funding for the Health and Safety Executive. One result has been drastically fewer inspections of workplace asbestos. We published a report on this last year and called in particular for two things: a target to remove all workplace asbestos within 40 years, together with a plan to deliver it, and a central digital register of all workplace asbestos and of its condition. The government rejected those recommendations, though I do welcome the agreement of the Minister, the Minister's colleague, to meet a group of us together with 3 industry groups and the Health and Safety Executive to discuss further the idea for a register. That meeting will take place, I think, later on this month. But I do very warmly welcome the launch of the campaign by the Sunday Times at the weekend, drawing attention to the continuing scale of the tragedy being inflicted by asbestos even now, a quarter of a century after its use was banned. It's still the biggest source of workplace-related deaths. And the Sunday Times campaign headlines in particular our 2 recommendations. And I do hope the ministers will now recognise the need to act. And I welcome the fact that the Sunday Times is going to be running this campaign, I think, on a consistent basis. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, I do want to thank again the Backbench Business Committee for recommending today's debate. I'd be very interested to hear from the Minister specifically how ministers are assessing whether the different cost of living support payments meet needs and whether they're reaching the right people, and also how and when ministers will decide whether payments along these lines will be needed next year. And I look forward to the debate we're about to have.